On the morning of September 2, 1945, as dawn spread thin light across Tokyo Bay, a gray American battleship lay anchored in still water. Officers in pressed uniforms gathered on its deck, documents arranged with deliberate care. Cameras were positioned. The ceremony was brief, formal, and exacting. Pens touched paper. The war, by official measure, ended there, framed by steel railings and recorded for history. Across the Pacific, church bells rang, factory whistles sounded, and headlines announced surrender in large, confident type. Yet at that same hour, far from the decks of ships and the crowds in city streets, the end of the war arrived without ceremony in places that would never appear in newsreels. In the interior of the United States, beyond the ports and victory parades, a different silence held. Barbed wire fences traced rigid lines across dry ground. Guard towers stood unmoving against wide skies. Inside these enclosed spaces, the passage of history was not marked by signatures or speeches, but by routine, the opening of gates, the calling of names, the careful accounting of bodies. Among those held were Japanese women classified as prisoners of war or enemy nationals. Their presence was an administrative detail, noted in memoranda and transport logs, rarely acknowledged beyond official channels. They had arrived months or years earlier, carried by train under guard, their windows shuttered, their destinations unknown until arrival. Some had been nurses attached to military units, others clerical workers, others wives or civilians displaced by the collapse of Japanese positions overseas. Their captivity was quiet, contained, and largely invisible. The camps themselves were functional rather than imposing. Wooden barracks, hastily constructed, stood in rows on packed earth. In some regions, dust settled into every seam of clothing. In others, damp air softened the edges of sound. The smell of pine or sage or wet soil lingered depending on geography. At dawn, a whistle cut through the air. At night, lights were counted and extinguished. Time was regulated, measured not by campaigns or casualties but by meals and inspections. Public memory of the war would later be shaped by images of triumph and devastation. Cities in ruins, soldiers returning home, flags raised over islands whose names were difficult to pronounce. The narrative allowed little space for ambiguity. Enemy and ally were clearly drawn. Victory carried moral clarity. Within the camps, however, the lived experience of those classified as enemies unfolded in a narrower, more uncertain register. The women learned quickly the texture of confinement. They folded issued blankets with precision, aware that untidiness invited scrutiny. They wore clothing supplied by an unfamiliar government: cotton dresses, sturdy shoes, sweaters when the weather cooled. The fabric was coarse, serviceable. Personal belongings were few, often reduced to what could be carried in a single bag. The sound of boots on gravel marked the changing of shifts. The gates opened and closed with a consistent metallic echo. It was within this controlled environment that a subtle dissonance emerged, one that did not announce itself loudly. The men who guarded the women did not resemble the figures carried in memory from home. They were taller than expected, their bodies broader, their faces less severe. Many were young, their expressions unguarded in moments when they believed they were not observed. Their uniforms smelled faintly of wool and tobacco. When they spoke among themselves, their voices carried a casual ease that contrasted sharply with the rigid discipline the women had known. At first, the women observed from a distance. Eyes lowered, speech minimal, posture contained. Years of instruction and wartime rhetoric had taught them to expect cruelty or indifference. Instead, they encountered something more difficult to classify. A guard held a door open rather than forcing it. Another gestured patiently when words failed. A canteen cup was refilled without comment. These actions were minor, easily overlooked, yet they accumulated, quietly undermining expectation. Official records from the camps were sparse and measured. Reports noted compliance, health conditions, labor assignments. Language was neutral, administrative. No incidents appeared frequently in margins. What such documents did not capture was the interior tension taking shape among the women, the effort required to reconcile what they saw with what they had been taught to believe. Sound carried differently inside the camps. The wind moving through wire produced a constant low vibration. In the evenings, the murmur of guards' conversations drifted toward the barracks, punctuated by brief laughter. Occasionally, music, soft, unpolished, emerged from somewhere beyond the fence. A harmonica, perhaps, or a radio tuned low. These sounds were unfamiliar and, for some women, deeply unsettling. The war had demanded certainty. It had required enemies to remain abstract, distant, stripped of individuality. In the camps, abstraction proved difficult to maintain. Faces became familiar. Patterns of movement repeated daily. The guard's height, remarked upon quietly among the women, became a point of fascination, not admiration but surprise. Their presence disrupted inherited images of the enemy as uniformly brutal or monstrous. This disruption did not lessen the reality of captivity. The wire remained intact. Armed men remained posted at intervals. Freedom existed elsewhere, announced by headlines and broadcasts the women only partially understood. Yet within the fences, the boundaries between fear and observation began to blur. Confusion replaced hatred in some minds, not as an act of forgiveness, but as a response to contradiction. The broader world moved toward celebration. Factories retooled. Soldiers prepared for homecoming. The language of victory filled public spaces. Inside the camps, routine persisted. Meals were served in enamel bowls. Work details continued. Names were called each morning, answers given in measured tones. The end of the war, when it arrived, would not immediately alter these rhythms. What unfolded in these overlooked spaces was not a story of reconciliation or transformation in any simple sense. It was an experience marked by proximity and restraint, by the slow erosion of certainty under the pressure of daily contact. The women did not cease to be prisoners. The guards did not cease to be representatives of an opposing force. Yet something less definable emerged in the space between them. This was the paradox that settled quietly into the camps as the war drew to a close, that confinement could coexist with moments of unexpected recognition, and that the image of the enemy could fracture not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of ordinary, unsettling details. In places designed to enforce distance and control, an unanticipated proximity took hold, one that raised a question neither victory nor surrender could fully answer. The routines of the camp asserted themselves with a steadiness that resisted larger events. Each day followed a pattern so consistent that time seemed to flatten. At first light, the whistle sounded. The women rose, folded blankets, straightened bedding. The barracks were swept, windows opened briefly to air out the lingering smell of sleep and damp wood. Outside, guards changed shifts, their boots striking gravel in a rhythm the women came to recognize without looking. Meals were taken at long tables. The food was plain and sufficient, prepared according to military guidelines rather than taste. Oatmeal, eggs, bread, sometimes canned fruit. Coffee for the guards, tea when supplies allowed for the women. Enamel cups clinked softly. Conversation remained subdued. The women spoke among themselves in low voices, careful not to draw attention, careful not to be misunderstood. Work assignments divided the day. Some women were sent to laundry, where steam rose from tubs and the smell of soap settled into their skin. Others cleaned administrative offices, wiping desks, emptying bins filled with forms they could not read. A smaller number worked in kitchens, chopping vegetables, washing pans, learning the unfamiliar layout of American stoves. The tasks were repetitive, physical, grounding. Hands grew rough. Fingernails cracked. Small cuts went unnoticed. Guards were present but rarely intrusive. They stood near doorways or walked the perimeter, rifles slung, posture relaxed rather than rigid. Their proximity was constant, yet their attention seemed diffuse. This too unsettled the women. In earlier stages of the war, surveillance had been sharp, disciplinary measures immediate. Here, watchfulness existed alongside a kind of inattentiveness, as though the guards trusted routine to maintain order. In diary fragments later recovered, one woman noted the sound of English spoken casually, without formality. She wrote of the way sentences rose and fell, how laughter interrupted speech. The language itself seemed loose, uncontained. She compared it to the clipped commands she remembered from military life, and the contrast troubled her more than she expected. Another woman recalled being struck by the guards' faces. They were not expressionless. They frowned, smiled, yawned. One guard, stationed near the laundry, hummed while leaning against a post. The tune repeated daily, slightly altered each time. The women began to anticipate it, marking the passage of hours by its return. The psychological shift did not occur all at once. It emerged unevenly, differently for each woman. Some resisted it, retreating inward, clinging to familiar narratives of enemy and self. Others found their assumptions eroding despite themselves. The process was quiet, often unnoticed until reflection made it visible. There were moments when ideology pressed back forcefully. News arrived sporadically, filtered through guards or translated notices. Reports of destruction, of cities lost, of an empire collapsing. The women absorbed these fragments with a mix of grief and numbness. At such times, the guards' ordinary behavior felt almost offensive, their ease incompatible with the scale of loss being conveyed. The women felt anger then, sharper for its suddenness. Yet even anger could not fully restore earlier certainties. The men who delivered the news did so without triumph. Their tone remained even, sometimes awkward. One guard reportedly said only, "The war is nearly over," before turning away. There was no celebration in his voice, no satisfaction. This absence of visible hostility complicated the women's responses. Clothing became another point of observation. The guards' uniforms were well-fitted, clean, replaced when worn. The women's clothing was utilitarian, repaired repeatedly. Still, the guards did not appear to take particular pride in their appearance. Shirts were sometimes rumpled, caps tilted back, jackets removed in the heat. This casualness contrasted with the formality the women associated with authority, creating a subtle dissonance. Occasionally misunderstandings occurred. A woman failed to follow an instruction she did not fully comprehend. A guard raised his voice, frustration evident. The tension tightened briefly, familiar and expected. Yet it did not escalate. Another guard intervened, repeating the instruction more slowly, gesturing. The moment passed. The women noted not the raised voice but its restraint. Repetition played its role. Day after day the same men appeared. Faces became fixed points in the landscape of captivity. A guard with freckles across his nose. Another with a slight limp. One who always checked his watch before the evening count. These details accumulated, rendering the guards less interchangeable, more individual. The women did not discuss this openly, but it shaped their internal landscape. Observers outside the camps occasionally remarked on the women's composure. Officials noted their discipline, their adherence to rules. This was interpreted as cultural inclination rather than psychological adaptation. Few considered what it required to maintain such composure in an environment that continuously challenged foundational beliefs. Civilians living nearby sometimes encountered the women during supervised work details. These encounters were brief, charged with mutual uncertainty. Eyes met then looked away. Once, a woman recalled, a local farmer's wife offered a piece of fruit through the fence, only to withdraw her hand quickly when a guard approached. The gesture lingered in memory not for its generosity, but for its hesitation. The guards themselves were not immune to contradiction. In letters home, some mentioned the women obliquely, referring to the Japanese girls without elaboration. Others avoided the subject entirely. A few expressed confusion. One letter, later archived, noted simply that the prisoners did not seem as expected, a phrase left unexplained. As weeks passed, the women became attuned to subtle shifts in atmosphere. The guards spoke more often of home. Leaves began to turn in colder regions. The quality of light changed. With these changes came an undercurrent of anticipation and unease. The war's end, when discussed, felt abstract, its implications unclear. The women questioned what release would mean. Return to a homeland altered beyond recognition. Separation from those who had died or disappeared. The guards, in contrast, spoke of return as something concrete. Train rides, reunions, jobs resumed. This asymmetry sharpened the women's sense of dislocation. Quiet realizations emerged without announcement. One woman wrote that she no longer felt fear when a guard approached, only alertness. Another admitted, with discomfort, that she had begun to expect fairness rather than cruelty. These admissions were not framed as betrayals, but as observations. They did not produce comfort. They produced uncertainty. The camp environment reinforced this uncertainty. The fences remained intact. The watchtowers cast long shadows at dusk. The rules were enforced consistently. There was no illusion of equality or freedom. Yet within these constraints, interactions unfolded that resisted simple categorization. A guard fell ill and was replaced temporarily by another less familiar. The women noticed the difference immediately. The replacement was more distant, less patient. Relief accompanied the original guard's return, a reaction that surprised the women themselves. They said nothing of it, but the recognition unsettled them. Repetition again did its work. Ordinary kindness, repeated without emphasis, acquired weight. Not enough to redefine the situation but enough to complicate it. The women did not interpret these acts as benevolence. They interpreted them as evidence of inconsistency in the world as they had understood it. As surrender became official, the camp did not erupt in celebration. Notices were posted. Schedules remained. The guards' demeanor shifted subtly, more subdued perhaps or simply more distant. There was an awareness that roles were changing, though the mechanisms of change remained slow. The women felt suspended between categories. No longer enemies in a war that had ended, not yet free individuals. The guards, too, occupied an uncertain space, their authority intact but provisional. Conversations grew fewer. A sense of waiting permeated the camp. Through all of this, the image that lingered most insistently was not one of conflict, but of incongruity. Tall men in uniforms that signified power, behaving in ways that confounded expectation. Women taught to fear them, learning instead to observe, to adapt, to hold contradiction without resolution. This psychological terrain was not dramatic. It unfolded in small increments, through repetition and proximity. It left no clear markers, no decisive moments. Only a gradual reshaping of perception that could not be easily articulated, even afterward. As departure approached, the women gathered their few belongings. The guards supervised, their presence quieter now. There were no speeches, no expressions of closure. The routines that had governed daily life dissolved slowly, replaced by uncertainty. What remained unresolved was not the fact of captivity, nor the reality of defeat, but the internal dissonance produced by encountering humanity where an enemy had been prescribed. The camps had enforced separation, yet proximity had undone simplicity. The women carried this unresolved tension with them as they prepared to leave, aware that it would not be easily shed, and that it would resist incorporation into any official account of the war. In the weeks that followed their departure from the camps, the women moved through a world that felt provisional, as though constructed from borrowed parts. Transport was arranged without ceremony. Trains carried them across landscapes they had only glimpsed through slatted windows on arrival. Stations passed without pause. The guards who had once counted them at dusk were no longer present, replaced by officials whose faces were unfamiliar and whose tasks were narrowly defined. Separation occurred without ritual. Names were checked off lists. Papers were stamped. Each woman stepped forward alone. For some, the journey ended quickly, folded into larger movements of repatriation and displacement. For others, it stretched on, marked by delays and uncertainty. There were holding centers, temporary quarters, long intervals of waiting. The war's end, so decisive in public memory, felt diffuse here, its boundaries unclear. Freedom did not announce itself. It emerged gradually, unevenly, and without relief proportionate to its promise. Years later, when the camps were spoken of at all, they appeared as footnotes or curiosities. Their locations were repurposed or erased. Timber barracks were dismantled. Wire fencing rusted then disappeared. The land absorbed the traces of occupation with indifference. In official accounts, the camps belonged to a category of necessary measures, administratively justified and briefly noted before attention shifted elsewhere. For the women, memory did not organize itself so neatly. The camps returned in fragments rather than narratives. A certain quality of light. The smell of soap on damp cloth. The sound of gravel under boots at dusk. These details surfaced without warning, often detached from chronology. They resisted interpretation, offering sensation without explanation. When the women spoke of their captivity, if they spoke of it at all, they did so cautiously. Language felt inadequate. The experience did not align with the dominant stories of suffering or resistance that circulated after the war. There was no appetite for complexity. The world preferred clarity, victims and perpetrators, cruelty and endurance. What the women carried was something less easily named. They remembered the guards, though rarely by name. Height was often mentioned, as were faces, gestures, voices. These recollections were not affectionate, nor accusatory. They were observational. The men had occupied a space that was both intimate and constrained, powerful and limited. They had been present daily, shaping the texture of captivity without defining its meaning. The women did not confuse this presence with kindness in any simple sense. The fences had been real. The authority had been enforced. Yet memory insisted on including contradiction. The image of an enemy did not hold. It fractured quietly, leaving behind a sense of dissonance that time did not resolve. For the guards, the camps receded into the background of a larger war experience. Some mentioned the assignment briefly in interviews or letters, framing it as uneventful. Others omitted it altogether. The women appeared occasionally in anecdotes, stripped of detail, reduced to a category. Few lingered on the psychological proximity the camps had created. As decades passed, the women aged into a world transformed by reconstruction and forgetting. Their lives accumulated other events, families, losses, routines. The camps did not dominate memory, but they did not disappear. They remained as points of quiet resistance to simplification. When asked directly about the war, some women spoke instead of ordinary things. The difficulty of adjusting to new food. The strangeness of American weather. The silence at night inside the barracks. These recollections baffled listeners who expected stories of brutality or heroism. The women rarely corrected these expectations. Silence proved easier than explanation. The paradox endured, that confinement had contained moments of recognition, and that recognition had not redeemed confinement. Both truths coexisted without hierarchy. The women did not seek to reconcile them. They lived with the unresolved tension, allowing it to occupy a private register. In later years, historians and documentarians approached the camps with renewed interest, seeking to map forgotten spaces and recover overlooked narratives. Records were consulted. Testimonies were gathered. The women's accounts were often hesitant, marked by pauses and digressions. Memory after so long had softened some edges and sharpened others. What emerged was not a counter-narrative to the war's dominant story, but a complication of it. The camps did not overturn the reality of conflict or defeat. They introduced uncertainty into a framework that had relied on certainty. They suggested that proximity could undermine abstraction, and that ordinary human behavior could unsettle even the most rigid ideological boundaries. This unsettling quality persisted in the way the women remembered the guards, not as symbols, but as individuals whose existence had intersected with theirs under conditions neither had chosen. The women did not claim understanding. They acknowledged only the encounter and its enduring ambiguity. The war, as commemorated, concluded with treaties and anniversaries. For those who had lived inside the camps, there was no equivalent marker. The experience did not end so much as recede, leaving traces that surfaced unpredictably. A tall stranger passing on the street. A familiar cadence in a foreign language. The smell of wool in winter. These moments did not prompt nostalgia or longing. They prompted recognition, fleeting and unsettling. The women understood, without articulating it, that the camps had altered the way they perceived power, enmity, and themselves. Not through revelation but through sustained exposure to contradiction. In the end, what the camps left behind was not a story easily told or neatly concluded. It was an accumulation of impressions that resisted moral alignment. Victory and defeat remained valid categories, but insufficient ones. Between them lay experiences that belonged fully to neither. The image that endures is a quiet one. A fenced compound far from any battlefield, where the noise of a global war diminished into routine sounds, and where women learned, without intending to, that the figure of the enemy could be destabilized not by ideology or persuasion, but by the persistent presence of an unexpected human face.